Hello. It's been a little while since I put out a RayTK tutorial, so I figure it's about time. This one is based on a scene that I made recently that I really liked, so I figured I'd share it with you all, and maybe you can come up with some interesting variations on it. The general idea is to make a sort of spiky torus shape with a few different types of distortion on it. Then we'll refine the material and the lighting to get it looking nice, and finally we'll add some animation in. You don't necessarily need to have any experience with RayTK in order to follow along. I'll explain as we go through why we're doing things the way that we are, but if you want a more detailed understanding of how RayTK works, I recommend watching at least the first couple of videos in the intro series. You can also do that after this so that you kind of make a thing and then understand how that thing works. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm starting with a template file that keeps things kind of compact to fit in the frame for the recording. I do actually have a link to that up on my Patreon. I'll put a link in the description of this video to it if you want to do that. It has this kind of like preview panel off to the side there. I like to use that instead of having like the render in the background of the network because I just find that to be visually confusing, but a lot of people seem to like doing it that way. So if that's what works for you, go for it. The first step is to go to RayTK's GitHub releases page and download the toolkit talks, and then drag that into your project. I like to do that at the root outside of the main project comp, and I do that because if you have it in the same network as your scene, you're going to see a whole bunch of these extra, like, kind of data connection lines, which can be kind of visually confusing. So that's why I like to stick it at the root, but put it wherever you like, as long as it's somewhere in the project, things will work. Open RayTK's palette using the Alt-R shortcut. If you don't see this when you hit Alt-R, it's possible that you have an NVIDIA GPU and there's another thing that's bound to that keyboard shortcut. If you go into your NVIDIA app settings, you can switch that off. Another option is to go to where you have the main toolkit component, and there are settings here where you can change the shortcut to something else that doesn't conflict with something else on your system. So do whatever shortcut you've used to open the palette, and we're going to type Raymarch render 3D. Click that, drop that into your project. And then drag out from that first output to create a null top. And then if you're going to be previewing things in the background, you would switch on the display flag there. But I'm doing it in the side panel just so things fit nicely in the frame. With the renderer selected, open RayTK's Editor Tools menu with Alt-Shift-R. And under Add Camera, choose Look at Camera. Select the renderer again, and then Alt-Shift-R again. And then under Add Light, choose Point Light. On the light, let's set the location to like 0.5, 0.5, and 2. And then on the camera, let's pull it back a bit and set the Z position to like 8. We're going to come back to this light a little bit later to dial in settings for that, but for now, this is good enough. The scene is based on a pointy pyramid shape. So let's start with a pyramid SDF. Click that, drag that into your project, and then wire that up to the first input on the renderer, and there we go, pyramid. It's not really exciting yet unless you're super into pyramids, but let's make this tall and pointy. So for the height, let's bump that up to around 1.5. And then for the width, let's drop it to maybe 0.7. Next, we'll take this shape and duplicate it in the pattern of a torus, where the pyramids are sticking out from the surface of the torus. So let's create a modulo toroidal. And then we're going to insert that between the pyramid SDF and the renderer. Then on that new operator, change the axis to Z so that it's kind of facing the camera. And let's put the camera up and to the side a little bit so we're not just looking at it like head on, to make things a little bit easier to understand. So Set the X and the Y position to like 2. So there we go. We can kind of see a little bit better there. On the modular tutorial, let's increase the radius up to maybe 1.8 or so. Kind of spread things out a little. And we can keep the thickness at 2. I mean, you can try changing that if you want and see how it just kind of like spreads out the sort of thickness of the torus that the spikes are being placed on, but I'm going to leave it at 0.2. Then try changing the 2 parts of the repetitions parameter. So one of them, the first one, is going to be the number of repetitions around the main axis of the torus. And the other one is going to be the number of repetitions around the body of the torus. It does actually accept like partial numbers of repetitions, but you're going to get render glitches if you do that. So I recommend sticking to whole numbers. I'm going to go with 12 and 8 or so. And we can tweak that later on. Then try out the 2 parts of the shift parameter. So the first one basically just kind of like spins everything around that main axis. So it's not super interesting in this case, but the other one kind of rolls the surface of the torus through itself. So you kind of get things coming out from the center and wrapping around or going the other way back in. So we'll add some animation to this later on to give it some movement. Now, these spikes are pretty spiky, which is pretty neat, but how much more exciting would they be if they were twisty? The answer is a lot. So we're going to do that. Let's add a twist operator. Make sure to get that one and not twirl, although we will actually be using twirl later. So for now, just stick with twist. So stick that between your pyramid SDF and the modular toroidal. Change the axis to Y. So we want to kind of twist things around the length of the spike and pyramids on the Y axis too. And then you can try changing this amount. And let's bump that up to like 3 or 4 something. I should probably change the range of that slider because that amount isn't super useful here, but whatever. So that gives us some nice twisty spikes, which is pretty great. Due to what seems to be actually a bug in this version of the toolkit, things are being alternated, like every other repetition of the spike is being flipped. And that's actually a good thing in this case. It means that when you have shapes that are kind of asymmetrical, that the parts are going to line up. So, if they're twisting, then you want to make sure that those parts are always lined up at the edges where it's like slicing space to do the repetition. In theory, we would want to do that by setting the mirror type here to grid. It looks like I might have swapped the behavior of the none and the grid options here. So if you're using a future version of the toolkit and you're seeing like things get kind of cut off and look a little weird there, then switch it over to grid. But I guess in this version of the toolkit, none is actually the option that you want here. Anyway, one twist is pretty great, but how much better it would be if we had another one, or at least something similar. Let's take the whole center area of that torus and kind of twist it. This time we're going to create a twirl operator and stick that after the modular toroidal. This operator is pretty similar to twist, but where the twist does kind of a continuous rotation along the axis, twirl basically does a little bit of rotation right around the area of the axis. And so it'll do like the maximum amount of rotation right in the center on the axis, and then it will do less and less rotation the further it gets out from that. So you're basically just like taking the middle and just kind of twisting it a little bit. On the twirl, bump up the amount and you'll start to see what it's doing there. So it's twisting the center of that overall shape. I'm going to set that to around 5. Doesn't have to be exact. And then you can use the size parameter to control the area that gets twisted. So if you have it really high, the entire shape is going to get twisted. But if you have it really low, it's just going to be the very center. Let's set that to around 1.5. Again, this doesn't have to be exact, but it can be if you want to. One thing to note is that if you push this amount too high, things are going to get kind of glitched out and you'll get like kind of tearing and pixelation going on in there. Some people like that as a look, as an aesthetic. So if that's your thing, push it as far as you want, go nuts. But otherwise, you would want to keep it to a lower value. So that's where that kind of 5 comes in, because that's enough to get some good action, but not so much that the whole thing gets glitched out. Either way, that's basically it for the actual shape that we're creating for this one. Now let's move on to the material. If you like how things look with the default material, I mean, you could just leave it here if you want, but otherwise, let's set up our own material. We're going to be doing a pretty standard setup here. If you've watched any of my other scene tutorials, this is probably going to be familiar to you. So first, we're going to wire up the different parts of the material, and then we're going to patch them into the scene. And we're doing that to avoid things kind of stalling as it recompiles the shader, which is going to be more of an issue as the scene gets a little bit larger. Though, thanks to some recent-ish changes that Derivative put into TouchDesigner, it generally doesn't stall the entire process. It just kind of like the output goes black. So that's definitely an improvement. Let's create a modular mat. And then with that selected, open the Editor Tools menu with Alt-Shift-R, and then under Add Diffuse, choose Orin Nayar. And then on the diffuse contrib, go to the method parameter, right-click that, and do Toggle Read Only. This will lock in that selection, which is going to allow RayTK to optimize things a bunch. I made a whole separate video about that technique, so check that out if you want to learn more about where you can use this trick and how it works. Then let's select Modular Mat again, and then Alt-Shift-R to open the Editor Tools menu. And then under Add Specular, this time choose GGX. And I'm just going to move things over here. And then we're going to do the same thing on Specular Contrib. So right-click Method and do Toggle Read Only. Then let's connect the twirl to the first input, and then we can connect it up to the renderer to patch it into the scene. And there we go. Things look a little bit different. On the diffuse contrib, I'm actually going to keep the defaults. Kind of looks okay as is. For the specular highlights, the sort of shiny bits, let's raise the roughness a little bit to maybe 0.7, 0.8, something around there. And that will kind of spread out those shiny areas to make it less kind of metallic. And then let's bump up the Fresnel to 1 to brighten things up. To be honest, I don't actually remember how that differs from the level parameter, but I don't know. Yeah. Oops. Let's adjust the color a little bit on the specular to give it a little bit of a blue. Just got a little bit of color variation in there. But mainly what we're going to be doing to come up with more interesting color on this is in the lighting. So we're going to keep the material relatively simple. If we want to use multiple lights in a RayTK scene, we need to use the multi-light operator. So open the palette and create a multi-light. And then let's connect the point light that we already have into the first input. And then with that multi-light selected, open the Editor Tools with Alt-Shift-R. And then under Add Light, choose Point Light, and it will stick another one on there. And then let's connect this up to the renderer. On the second light, let's set the color to more of like an orange. Could be pretty saturated there. And then for the position, we're going to move it off to the left a bit, so like negative 0.5, and then down, so maybe like negative 2 or so, and then back, so positive 2. And then on the other point light, the original one, let's make it just like a little bit green. This combination of orange and pale green is something that I tend to use a lot. I really like it. Though you should also experiment with different color schemes and see what works for you. So now let's get things moving with animation for a couple of different parameters in the scene. Or I guess if you want still images or something, you can just kind of like leave it as is, but I like to keep my shapes a little bit more active. It helps them maintain their health. So let's animate the twisting of the spikes first. So select the twist operator, the one that's coming right out of the pyramid SDF, open the Editor Tools with Alt-Shift-R, And then under animate with speed, we're going to choose shift. And on the speed generator, let's bump up the first part of that speed parameter to maybe 1.5. And then you can hit the reverse to make it go kind of out from the torus surface, or keep it off to have it go inwards. Then select the modulo toroidal. I'm just going to give myself a little bit more room there. And so with that operator selected, open the editor tools again with Alt-Shift-R. And then under animate with speed, we have the shift parameter, and then we have the two individual parts of it. The part that we want to animate is just the second part, because the other one just kind of like rotates the whole thing, and we'll add a rotate operator for that in a sec. So let's just hit Shift 2. And then you can adjust the speed there however you like. But I think the default works okay. So you can kind of like use the slider to dial that in. And the last part is to just kind of spin the whole shape overall. So let's add a rotate for that. And connect that up between the twirl and the material. And then with the rotate selected, do Alt-Shift-R, and under animate with speed, choose rotate XYZ and grab the whole parameter, not just one of the parts. And then since this is using angles, we want larger values. So let's change the first three parts, the value multiplier to like 30 or so. And then you can adjust the speed for the different axes. And then use the slider to control the overall speed of all the axes. And that's it for this one. To recap, we are starting with a pyramid SDF to make a spike shape, and then we're twisting it with some animation on the offset of that twist to kind of get the whole thing continuously moving. And then we repeat that in a torus pattern using modulo toroidal, and we're animating the shift of the layout of that torus surface, so it's kind of rolling in on itself. And then we added a twirl to twist the middle area of the ring. And then we added a rotate to kind of get the whole thing spinning, and modular material with diffuse and specular shading, pretty standard setup there. And then for the light, we used a multi-light to combine two different point light sources with different colors in different positions to get some more interesting color variation. You can get a bunch of different looks out of this by messing with the number of repetitions here. So if you set it, really high, you get these kind of like rings. Or if you set both parts really high, then it turns into kind of a orb sphere donut-y thing. And then, you can do a much lower number for the first part, and then you get like a fixed number of these sort of discs. One thing to note is that when you're dealing with mirroring, or which, despite what the mirror type parameter says here, it is actually using mirroring, you want to have an even number of repetitions so that you don't get one half cut off without like another half to match that and line up. You'll notice that we're getting a little bit of distortion there. And so on the twirl, we can adjust the amount there to control how much we're twisting. Because if it does too much of a change in rotation over too short of a distance, the renderer gets a little bit confused, and that's where you get parts of shapes kind of like disappearing. You could also try adding other kinds of distortion after this, like a modulo polar to do like kind of a kaleidoscope on the whole thing, or, modulo 1D to repeat it in a line, or try different lighting arrangements. Anyway, I look forward to seeing what you all do with this. If you're posting about it, use the RayTK hashtag and tag me if you want to show off your work. If you want to support RayTK development and me making tutorials in general, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get early tutorial access and scene file downloads, including one for this tutorial, and Discord and other stuff like that. And even if you don't want to pay, you can subscribe for free as a way to get announcements about RayTK and tutorials that I'm making. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'll put links in the description for that. Anyway, thanks for watching and make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Let me know if you like this or if there's other kind of scenes that you want to learn how to build. Bye.